Someone once planted a small garden and decided that was enough. Not enough for a lifetime, perhaps, but enough for an afternoon, enough to feel that something was right. We all know that feeling. It comes and goes without warning. A cup of tea gone cold on the windowsill, a conversation that didn't need to end, the particular light on a Tuesday in October. And then it passes, and we wonder if we imagined it. Happiness is one of the oldest questions a person can ask, not because the answer is hidden somewhere difficult to reach, but because the question itself keeps changing shape. Ask it at 20 and you get one answer. Ask it at 50 and the words mean something different. Ask it in grief, in comfort, in ordinary boredom. Each time, it sounds like a new question. What is strange is that we pursue it so earnestly, and yet we struggle to say what it actually is. Whether it is a feeling or a way of living, whether it belongs to a single good hour or to a whole life seen from the end. People have been sitting with this question for a very long time, and they have arrived at answers that contradict each other completely. Some of those answers are consoling, some are demanding, some are almost unbearably honest. We'll spend some time with each of them. Around 300 BCE, a man bought a small garden on the outskirts of Athens. He planted vegetables. He invited friends to live with him. He charged no fees. He asked only that people think carefully about how to live. His name was Epicurus, and he was not what most people imagine when they picture an ancient philosopher. He was not a nobleman. He was not hunting for glory. He was, by most accounts, frequently ill, and yet he described himself as happy. Genuinely, quietly happy. That detail is worth sitting with. The world around him was loud with wanting. Athens had markets and temples and theaters and ambitious men climbing over one another toward power. Epicurus looked at all of it and asked a simple question. What do we actually need in order to feel at ease, not comfortable in theory, at ease in the body on an ordinary afternoon? His answer was almost shockingly modest. Very little, far less than we think. He made a distinction that most of us forget the moment we open a browser or walk into a shop. There are desires that come from our nature and desires that come from our imagination. Hunger is natural. The wish for a particular dish in a particular restaurant served a particular way, that is the imagination at work. Thirst is natural. The craving for status, novelty, luxury, those are inventions. Epicurus was not against pleasure. He loved it. But he thought we had confused two very different things. We had mistaken the stories we tell about what we need for the needs themselves.
The wealth required by nature is limited and is easy to procure, but the wealth required by vain ideals extends to infinity. 15.
Read that slowly and you start to feel what he meant. Natural needs have a ceiling. You eat until you are full. You rest until you are rested. But imaginary needs have no ceiling at all. There is always a bigger house, always a newer version, always someone who has more. If your happiness depends on satisfying those needs, you have signed up for a race that has no finish line. This is the heart of what Epicurus taught. Happiness is not something you build by adding more. It is something you uncover by subtracting what was never really necessary. The garden was not just where he happened to live. It was the argument made visible. Grow a little food. Sit with people you love. Think clearly about your fears. That is enough. That is, in fact, quite a lot.
Of all the means which wisdom acquires to ensure happiness throughout the whole of life, by far the most important is friendship. 28.
Not wealth, not fame, not the right opinions about you in the right circles. Friendship. The kind that asks nothing spectacular of you. The kind that simply keeps you company in the ordinary hours. Epicurus believed that most of our suffering comes from wanting things that cannot actually make us feel at home, and that the cure is not discipline or denial, it is clarity. See what you genuinely need, and you will find it is already almost within reach. He was not promising a life without difficulty. He was suggesting that a great deal of our unhappiness is self-inflicted, not through weakness, but through confusion. We pursue the infinite when we need the finite. We chase what impresses others when what we actually want is to feel settled inside ourselves. Epicurus sat in his garden and felt settled. That was his philosophy. Not an idea about happiness so much as a practice of it, lived out quietly, among friends, with enough bread and enough conversation to call a day well spent. But what happens when the garden wall is broken down, when fortune does not cooperate? Seneca knew the answer from bitter experience. He was one of the most powerful men in Rome. He was also one of the most precarious. He served as tutor and advisor to the Emperor Nero. He accumulated vast wealth, and he watched, year by year, as Nero grew stranger and more dangerous. In the end, Nero accused him of conspiracy. Seneca was ordered to take his own life. He did in the year 65 AD, opening his veins in a warm bath while dictating to his secretaries to the last. This is a man who had thought about happiness under real pressure, not the pressure of discomfort, which Epicurus had managed so elegantly in his garden. The pressure of empire, of exile, of sudden ruin, of a world that could turn on you without warning and without fairness. Seneca's answer began with a simple observation. Pleasure comes and goes. So does pain. The external world is unstable by nature. If you build your happiness on what the world gives you, then you have handed the keys of your inner life to something that does not care about you. Fortune, he said, is not your friend. She is a player. She gives and she takes back, often on the same afternoon. So what could be stable? Seneca thought the answer was not a feeling at all. It was a posture, a way of standing inside your own life. He called it something we might translate as equanimity, a settled, clear-eyed acceptance of whatever comes. Not resignation, not numbness, something more like a deep readiness. The wise person, in Seneca's view, does not chase good fortune or flee bad fortune. They practice meeting both with the same quality of attention. They ask, given what is actually happening, what is the right thing to think, to do, to be? That question, asked calmly, repeatedly, honestly, is where Seneca locates the closest thing to happiness that a human life can hold. He was especially interested in what suffering leaves behind. There is something in us that can look back on hard times and find, not just survival, but a kind of quiet pride. The wound becomes a scar, and the scar becomes a story. That sweetness is not accidental, Seneca thought. It is what happens when a person has passed through difficulty without flinching from it. The endurance itself becomes part of who you are. And who you are, your character, your steadiness, is the one thing fortune cannot easily take. This is Seneca's revision of the question. Epicurus said, "Reduce your wants, find a quiet place, protect your peace." Seneca says, "You may not get a quiet place. The storm may come to you, so the work is not to find shelter. The work is to become, slowly and seriously, someone the storm cannot unmake." Happiness, for Seneca, is less a destination and more a discipline. It is the daily practice of not being governed by fear or desire. It is choosing, again and again, where you put your weight, not on what you have, on who you are becoming. That is steadier ground. Not solid, nothing is solid but steadier. Yet Seneca's composed sage still wants virtue, wants a good death, wants to matter, and will not forgive him that. Arthur was born in Danzig in 1788, the son of a wealthy merchant and a mother who would become a celebrated novelist. He grew up comfortable, traveled widely, and watched his father die, possibly by his own hand, when Arthur was still a young man. He inherited enough money to live without working, and he spent the rest of his life in rented rooms, mostly alone, convinced that the world was built on suffering. He watched people, he watched them strive. He noticed something that he could not unfeel. The moment you get what you want, the wanting simply moves. It doesn't stop. It finds a new object and starts pulling again. Desire, he thought, is not a problem you solve. It is the engine of being alive, and engines do not rest. He called this engine the will, not will in the sense of choosing to raise your hand, something deeper, a blind, restless force that drives everything: hunger, ambition, lust, the itch to be noticed, the fear of disappearing. You did not create this force. You were born into it. It runs through you the way a current runs through a wire. And so the promise at the heart of Epicurus, find the right conditions, remove the pain, and a calm sufficiency will remain, thought this was a beautiful lie. The conditions aren't the problem. The wanting is the problem. Calm sufficiency is not what waits beneath desire. Beneath desire there is only more desire, or else a dull emptiness that feels no better.
Every time a man is begotten and born, the clock of human life is wound up anew to repeat once more its same old tune that has already been played innumerable times, movement by movement and measure by measure, with insignificant variations.
That image of the clock is not poetic cruelty, for it was plain description. We are repeated. We are wound up and set going. We strive, we briefly achieve, we want again, we suffer, we die. And this is not a problem history will fix. It is what life is. So where does that leave happiness? Does not say it never exists. He says it exists the way a pendulum exists at the center of its swing as a moment between one pain and the next. You are briefly not hungry, not bored, not anxious. That is happiness. It does not accumulate. You cannot store it. The pendulum moves on. His most honest prescription, then, was not a program for living well. It was closer to a withdrawal. Stop feeding the will. Sit with music. Lose yourself in art, because art asks nothing of you and wants nothing in return. And above all, turn toward the suffering of others, not to fix it, but to recognize it as your own. Compassion, for, was the one crack in the wall of selfishness. The one moment the relentless engine paused. This is a dark teaching, but it has a strange honesty. He is not telling you to want better things, or to want more wisely, or to want with more virtue. He is saying, the wanting itself is the wound, And any account of happiness that refuses to look at that is not wisdom, it is comfort, and famously had little patience for comfort. The question he leaves behind is a quiet, unsettling one. If the very engine of your life is the source of your suffering, what would it mean to be free of it? Not dead, not numb, but genuinely, radically free. He suspected almost no one ever found out. But to simply fold into renunciation feels like another kind of cowardice. And John Stuart Mill demands we stay in the world and build something. Mill was born in London in 1806. His father, a stern and brilliant man, treated his son's education as an experiment. By 3, the boy was learning Greek. By 8, Latin. By 12, he had read more philosophy than most scholars manage in a lifetime. It was an extraordinary childhood and also a joyless one. When Mill was 20, something inside him gave way. He called it a crisis of the soul. He asked himself a simple question: if everything he had worked toward were suddenly achieved, would he be happy? The answer came back quietly, no. He wept. Or rather, he found he could not weep. He felt nothing at all. What brought him back was poetry, mostly long verses about nature and ordinary feeling. They reminded him that the inner life was real, that it mattered, that it could be cultivated like a garden. This was not a small discovery. It changed everything he went on to write. Mill had inherited a philosophy called utilitarianism. The idea, in plain terms, is this: the right action is the one that produces the most happiness for the most people. Simple enough. But Mill thought the version he inherited was too crude. It counted pleasures as if they were coins, identical units, just more or less of them. He refused that. He said pleasures differ in kind, not just in quantity. The pleasure of reading a difficult poem is not the same as the pleasure of a second helping of cake. One stretches you, one doesn't, and the stretching matters. He put it memorably: it is better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. A life of shallow comfort, he thought, is not a full human life. We are capable of more, and what we are capable of, we are in some sense obligated to pursue.
I regard utility as the ultimate appeal on all ethical questions, but it must be utility in the largest sense, grounded on the permanent interests of man as a progressive being.
Progressive is a quiet but important word there. Mill believed that human beings are not fixed. We grow, we revise, we become. And a society that suppresses that through conformity, through fear, through the dead weight of custom, is a society that makes happiness harder to reach. This is where his thinking opens outward. Personal happiness, for Mill, cannot be sealed off from the world around it. You cannot flourish in isolation. You flourish by contributing, by caring about things larger than yourself, by developing your mind, by allowing others the same freedom to develop theirs. He spent years fighting for causes he would not live to see resolved: the rights of women, the reform of Parliament, the dignity of workers. He understood that the world improves slowly across generations, and that this is no reason for despair.
The remedies for all our diseases will be discovered long after we are dead, and the world will be made a fit place to live in after the death of most of those by whose exertions it will have been made so. It is to be hoped that those who live in those days will look back with sympathy to their known and unknown benefactors.
There is something almost tender in that passage. Mill is not promising reward. He is asking us to act well across time, to plant trees whose shade we will never sit in. That is his answer to darkness. Not denial, not escape, but engagement. Happiness is not a prize waiting at the end of the road. It is what happens when a person lives fully, thinks honestly, and remains open to others. It is earned not by grasping but by giving attention to ideas, to people, to the patient work of making things better. And yet, even here, a question lingers. Mill tells us how to pursue happiness. He is less sure what it finally is. Perhaps that uncertainty is the point. Perhaps happiness, examined closely enough, always keeps moving just ahead of us, and the movement itself is where we find it. Mill extended happiness outward. He made it a social project, a shared ambition, but looked at that extension and asked a quiet, devastating question. Who, exactly, was invited in? Was born in Paris in 1908. She grew up in a world that had very clear ideas about what a woman's life should look like. Orderly, domestic, content. She was expected to find her happiness in a particular shape, a husband, a home, a softly bounded existence. She refused all of it. She wrote instead. She thought instead. She built a life on her own terms, alongside Jean and classrooms and the long argument of a shared intellectual life. And from that vantage point, she saw something that most philosophy had quietly looked past. Happiness, as it was offered to women, was not really happiness at all. It was something else. It was a kind of managed calm, a life made comfortable enough that the deeper question, what do I actually want, who do I actually want to become, never had to be asked. She called it, in essence, a sedative, not her word for it, but her meaning. Society hands certain people a pleasant enough cage. The cage is warm, there is food, there is routine, and the person inside may genuinely feel day to day that nothing is wrong, but something has been traded away. The possibility of choosing, the risk of wanting something that the world has not pre-approved. So argument is this: freedom is not a feeling, it is an act. And if you have never risked anything, never stepped into uncertainty, never pushed against what was expected of you, then the ease you feel is not joy. It is anesthesia. You have been made comfortable precisely so that you will not move. This is where she brings the whole long question of happiness to its sharpest edge. Every thinker before her asked how to find happiness, or keep it, or deserve it. She asked something more unsettling. She asked whether the happiness we are handed might be the very thing standing in the way of a life genuinely lived. Authentic happiness, for, cannot be given. It can only be made. It comes from the act of choosing, really choosing, not just accepting. It comes from the friction of a self pressing against the world and shaping something in return. And that means it will sometimes be uncomfortable. It will sometimes look, from the outside, like restlessness or ingratitude or refusal. But that refusal, she would say, is not the opposite of happiness. It is the beginning of it. And so we arrive at the end of this long conversation. From Epicurus in his garden, finding that enough is enough. Through the Stoics, learning to hold the world lightly. Through darkness, Mill's outward reach, and now here, leaves us not with an answer but with a task. Happiness is not waiting to be found. It is waiting to be risked. The mind that keeps asking the question is already, in some important way, free. There is no last word on this. That much, at least, the centuries seem to agree on. Epicurus found his answer in a garden. Bread, water, a few good friends. He called that enough. And perhaps it was. Perhaps it still is on the right evening. Seneca sat closer to the fire. He knew the world could take everything, so he practiced losing it quietly in advance. He called that freedom, not happiness exactly, something steadier than happiness. Then arrived and blew the candle out. He said the wanting itself is the wound. Every wish satisfied only clears the way for the next one. The wheel keeps turning. He wasn't trying to depress you. He was trying to be honest. Mill lit the candle again, but differently. He said, grow, read, love someone, stretch the shape of who you are. The good life is wide, not just comfortable. And then ask the quietest, most unsettling question of all. She asked who taught you to want what you want. She asked whether the happiness you are chasing was designed for someone else. She asked you to look at the blueprint before you start building. So here you are, holding 5 different answers, none of them wrong, none of them complete. Maybe that is the point. Maybe happiness is less like a place you arrive at and more like a question you carry. It changes weight as you age. It means something different at 30 than it did at 17. Different again after loss. The examining never quite finishes. And perhaps that is not a failure of the mind. Perhaps that is just what a living mind does. You can set the question down for an evening, eat something good, sit somewhere quiet, let the world be ordinary for a little while. The question will still be there in the morning. And that, strangely, might be enough.